first of all, I want to thank everybody associated with the Roundtable who has brought us here tonight. And my wife and I really do love coming to Fredericksburg in the area. You know, I come to you from Gettysburg, where there was one big battle, right? And I can come here where, as you all know, 4 big battles. So there's not many places where I feel humbled historically to attend, but Fredericksburg is definitely one of those places. So it's a real honor to be here. However, we're not going to talk about big battles tonight. We're going to talk about a famous story, and I apologize, the remote clicker is not working, so I'm going to have to kind of awkwardly do this about 40 times tonight, and that didn't work, so hold on. May get even more awkward than that. Okay, hold on.
It's this one.
That's not it. Hold that thought. That's right. Maybe the remote clicker started working while we were reading.
I tried it.
No, it's not working.
This has never happened before. This is a new one.
Yeah, stop. Stop recording. Oh, there was something I
Now
did.
it's going. I don't know what I did, but hopefully that works from here on out. It's not working.
We can do this without PowerPoint, but I really don't want to do it without PowerPoint.
Oh, we can do it right here.
Try that one.
All right, there we go.
Okay, so we've got, so I'm gonna slide this. Okay, so we still have kind of some awkward maneuvering going on tonight, but we're gonna make this work. So, yeah, as I said, remember on that last slide when I talked about we weren't gonna do any big battles? We're not gonna do any big battles. I am gonna talk about a very controversial general in the Union Army, Dan Sickles, before he was a Union general. I found some irony in the fact that you were giving away a George Meade image tonight. If anybody knows the Meade-Sickles relationship, there's some irony there. But again, that's not what we're doing tonight. But I will point out that Dan Sickles was a noteworthy figure, not only at my Gettysburg, where he may or may not have nearly lost the battle for the Union Army, but for you guys and ladies, he was present at the Battle of Fredericksburg and was a noteworthy figure at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So I do want to make sure you appreciate that there is a local connection here tonight with that.
Use the mouse on the.
That's what I'm trying.
Oh, that's not working.
Okay, there it is. Okay. So instead, I come to you tonight with a love story. The love story of Dan Sickles on the screen left and his lovely smiling bride, Teresa Baggioli Sickles, on the screen right. Just a little bit of personal background on the two. Dan Sickles was born in October of 1819. He was a New Yorker, Brooklyn area, born from a wealthy family, and was an only child. And I think like a lot of wealthy only children tended to be spoiled, rebellious. Some people would argue that he never really grew up in his entire life. But in 1838, when he was only 19 years old, he met a family friend, Lorenzo de Ponte's adopted daughter, Teresa, when she was age 2. Okay, so you're 19, you meet your future wife at age 2. Nothing creepy going on there. But Sickles at that time was a high-flying politician in early New York City politics, specifically Tammany Hall politics. And if you know the name Tammany Hall, Democrat, corruption, powerhouse, and he was a rising star within Tammany Hall. He was also a self-taught attorney within New York, so he's rising up through the New York State Assembly. In September of 1852, Sickles, then 33, married Teresa, then 16. Why would a 33-year-old political rising star marry a 16-year-old student? Okay, I see people doing this.
Love.
Money.
Money. Mama.
I know I said this was a love story, but not love. Could have been some love. She was pregnant.
Yeah.
She was pregnant. Families, although they were, the families were friends, they were not happy about this arrangement, although they eventually did reconcile because of it. And they got married. Teresa gave birth to one daughter, Laura, and things sort of continued on with his career. He became part of the New York Corporate President James Buchanan, and Dan Sickles was also a driving political figure in the establishment of New York Central Park in 1855. And that's really about all we're going to really do with the heavy background stuff tonight. Again, just kind of wanted to give you an idea. This dude was a player in 1850s politics, a rising star, a guy with a bright future, and who knows, might have gone beyond just New York when he was elected to Congress in 1856 and reported in the spring of 57 to begin his term. So the future looks pretty bright for him. Now this is Teresa, though. Let's talk a little bit about her as the very young wife, then 22 years old, of a congressman. She was sort of, with the ensuing story here, she was sort of reported different ways in the newspapers, the tabloids, the media of the time. Over on the far left, we have a contemporary image of her, quote, described as more like a schoolgirl than a polished woman of the world. So she's considered by her contemporaries to be very young, almost too young to be put in this kind of high-pressure wife of a congressman situation. Described as a sweet, amicable manner. It doesn't quite look like it in the middle image, but maybe Dan has done something to cross her on that one. But then on the far right, there's also another image of her, a beautiful, voluptuous siren without brains or shame, with a lust for men whom Sickles loved to madness. And again, these are all contemporary descriptions, and part of the point that I'm trying to get at is they kind of run the gamut from sweet schoolgirl to, little tramp sort of thing. And I think, and I'm going to try to go backwards for a minute.
Should be able to do that.
Yeah, I know. And, ultimately, I think if you look, if the photographic image of her, a kid, more than anything a kid, she's going to be preyed upon by a couple of these guys. Okay, now I'm going to be too far back. 2, 3, 4. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why I thought it would be a good idea to do this presentation here regionally, being so close to Washington, D.C. How many of us are familiar with Lafayette Square, Lafayette Park, across from the White House? I imagine a good number of us have been there on at least one occasion. Well, this is going to be the crime scene in our story tonight. So we're going to do a little bit of CSI here to kind of introduce us to the crime scene. Down at the southern end of the square, you have the President's house. What we know today is the White House, the President's mansion, Pennsylvania Avenue. And then you have this square kind of north of Pennsylvania Avenue. 1800, you can see the square was used as a staging area for the construction of the White House. They started putting buildings in the square 1816 to 1820. You have St. John's Church, which is very famous, known as the President's Church, just outside of the White House. You have some other noteworthy buildings going in the square. This early map also shows the residence that would be the home of Dan and Teresa Sickles when he reported for Congress beginning in 1857. So that's a noteworthy structure. This is also a structure, a clubhouse that's going to play a part in our story. I'll come back to this a little bit later than that in the story. So the idea, though, is when Dan and Teresa Sickles moved to Washington in 57, Sickles' mentor, James Buchanan, has just been elected to the White House. So not only do you have a high-flying guy, Dan Sickles, with some political connections and achievements in New York, they are also heavily connected with the new president in the White House. So again, as I've said, things are really looking promising for Dan and Teresa Sickles. They're in a very prestigious, fashionable neighborhood. It is said that they hosted very elegant, elaborate parties with Buchanan. The Sickelses would often be in the White House partying with Buchanan. Buchanan would be often going across the street to spend time with Dan and Teresa. So again, well-connected, well-heeled to make the term there. This is an early image of Lafayette Square, maybe the earliest image, I believe, on record. Early 1850s, around 1853, 54, maybe 55 when this image is taken. So only a few short years before tonight's story takes place. That is the considered, at the time, a real engineering feat to get an equestrian monument with two hoofs in the air. It's still there. And then again, St. John's Church, which I reference in one of the earlier slides. And when I say it's across from the White House, modern image, of course, it's really right across from the White House. This is a modern view that I took. The Sickles house is only 150, 200 yards away. Now the slides are changing on their own. That's kind of creepy. You guys saw it. I was standing up here, didn't touch a thing. Yeah, I saw it. The Sickles house is no longer there. It was on the western end of the square on what is known today as Jackson Place, a series of row homes which were designed to look historic, but they're really not historic. Jackie Kennedy, just as a quick trivia question, Jackie Kennedy in the 1960s when Lafayette Square was almost threatened with destruction, Jackie really stepped in and she liked the character of the square and helped ensure that it was historically preserved. So we actually owe the existence of that to Jackie Kennedy. That's what that part of the square looks like today. This is what it looked like in the 1850s. Now, then on the last slide, a little bit of them here on this slide. So Dan Sickles' house, it was what was called the Ewell or Stockton Mansion, built circa 1820. You can see it was a single-story home. I use this image because we have no photographs of the house itself, but this was printed in newspapers at the time, contemporarily, so it gives us an idea what the Sickles place looked like. Again, as I said, a very fashionable location, very prestigious house right across from the president. Sickles moves in, he has his young family, his staff, a dog, all of them kind of moving in their location. The house was ultimately demolished in the 1860s, 1870s, and I mentioned the name, the Thomas Ewell House, named after one of the prior owners. There is a little bit of a Civil War connection. The prior owner, Dr. Thomas Ewell, was the father of future Confederate General Richard Ewell. Now, Richard Ewell was not born in that house. Ewell seems to have been born in residence in Georgetown and raised in Prince William County. But I'd be remiss to a Civil War audience if I did not mention that connection. Okay, so let's get over to Washington. Now, if you can see, this contemporary image, February of 1859, takes place really as our story kind of starts here. Washington in the 1850s was a party town. It still is today, but you might think in the old days it was less so, and that's simply not the case. Particularly during the Buchanan years, pre-war years, elaborate balls, parties, things of that nature. It's been said in some corners that the Civil War, as tensions started heating up in Congress, the tensions in Congress, it's been said, were exasperated by the fact that the congressmen were often drinking or drunk on the job. So it's an era where alcohol is flowing freely, and again, people are just heavily socializing. As the wife of a new congressman, young Teresa Sickles had very significant social obligations. She was expected to either hold a weekly reception, attend similar functions given by other people, and pretty much every night she had to be somewhere doing something. If you've ever read the memoirs of Virginian socialite Virginia Clay, and who hasn't read them, right? Virginia Clay said that after each party, she would be so exhausted that she would literally hook herself up to like an electric shock box, give her a jolt to get her ready for the next party. And that was the way she had to stay away. Today it might be amphetamines or whatever, but back then you just wired yourself to a shock box and let it go. As a congressman, Sickles was often going back and forth to New York. Dan Sickles, in case you don't know the story, was also a significant ladies' man, and his own philandering did not end when he got married. All right, so he also continued to carry on extramarital affairs. And the point point being, he wasn't home all the time at night. Now at the time, it was common practice for established escorts, friends of the husband, to escort women, wives, to these parties when the husband was away. And I guess it gives the wife something to do while at the same time she's with a safe partner that can keep the wolves at bay from the single guys in the audience. So who's going to escort Teresa while Dan is away? Well, this is escort extraordinaire, Philip Barton Key. Do I have any Francis Scott Key descendants in the audience today? Okay, sometimes when I get close to Maryland or DC, they show up in the audience. I just thought I would check. Philip Barton Key. He was a district attorney from the District of Columbia. This was a politically appointed position. Key, of course, if you don't know the story, was the son of Francis Scott Key. So a very well-established, well-heeled Maryland family, but his position as a district attorney was a politically appointed one, and Key was worried that the Buchanan administration was going to appoint somebody else. However, Key and Dan Sickles, had met playing cards and socializing together. They took a liking to each other, and Sickles said, "Don't worry, Key, I'll intercede with Buchanan on your behalf." You know, I kind of almost, boy, I hate to bring modern politics into this, but I kind of almost envision like a Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Sickles, Buchanan kind of relationship going on here. As the room gets very awkwardly silent. But Sickles uses his influence, and I did that on purpose. Sickles uses his influence with Buchanan to keep Key on the job. So Key owes his job to Dan Sickles. I just want you to remember that when we get a few slides into this story. However, Key, unlike his father, Francis Scott was considered very studious, hardworking, very attentive to his duties. The apple fell pretty far from the tree with this character, because Barton Key, and I should have pointed out, by the way, this is Barton Key, that's Francis Scott, because I know you're way back in the back of the room, I don't know how well you can see this, but that's Philip Barton Key. Anyways, Philip Barton Key was a well-known ladies' man within this Washington society that I talked about. The aforementioned Virginia Clay described Key in her memoirs as foremost among the popular men of the capital, the handsomest man in all Washington society, in appearance an Apollo. He was a prominent figure at all the fashionable functions, a graceful dancer, a favorite with every hostess, clever at repartee, a generous and pleasing man. That's how she described him. First-rate fellow, ready at a joke or a frolic. And it was reported later that Key had reportedly said that he only needed 36 hours with any woman to make her do whatever he wanted. 36 hours. What do you think, Scott?
37.
37.
He's getting up in years.
He's getting up in years. Exactly. All right. So you've got this character now escorting Teresa Sickles. Dan thinks his wife is safe with his friend. His wife is not safe with Philip Barton Key. So my holy grail would be to find a photo of Philip Barton Key someday. The family has sent me one that I'm not convinced on. This is not it, by the way. I did a thing on the Travel Channel on this case a number of years ago, and this was the guy they cast as Philip Barton Key. And I don't know, I just thought it was appropriate. So we're going to pretend this is Philip Barton Key tonight. Okay. Okay, we're stuck again. Hold on. Okay. So these are sort of the three protagonists in the story. Congressman Dan Sickles, trusting his best friend and his wife to do the right thing while he's away cavorting with hookers and other women and things of that nature. Dan Sickles. Teresa, again, as I said before, looked on by many as really a mere child, even though she is the wife of a congressman, probably feeling neglected, because her husband is A, away from home a lot, and B, kind of an all-around jerk. And then last but not least, this dashing, popular, clever ladies man who is escorting her to all of the favorable functions of the day. Well, they start fooling around, and they start having an affair, and it starts at parties. They come to parties together, they leave together, they ride in the same coach together. They're seen, you know, on the streets and things of that nature. And the town, Washington, the town, starts talking quickly. Hey, what's going on with Key and Mrs. Sickles and things of that nature. At one point, they're spotted going into a hotel together. And this specifically gets back to Congressman Sickles, and he confronts his friend about it and basically says, look, I've heard these rumors, what's going on here? And Key denies it. He basically lies about it. He says, you know, these rumors, this is the highest affront which can be offered to me, and, you know, tell me who's spreading these scandalous rumors, and I will challenge that person to a duel. I will meet him with a pistol, that sort of thing. So he is very indignant about it, at least on the surface, convinces Sickles that nothing is going on, but he also tells Teresa, okay, stop hanging out with Key. When I'm away, I don't want to see him at the house, you know, nothing. I don't want to see any more about this. So, Key is a player, and he's got to play. So he's going to up his game now a little bit. And okay, if I can't go to Sickles' house and we can't be seen in public, we're going to rent a house a couple of blocks away from Lafayette Square. So they rent a little shack. I call it a shack because it was in what was then a low-rent part of town. It was in an African-American part of town. So I'm thinking Key and Teresa stuck out like a sore thumb, you know, going in and out of this place. But nevertheless, they rent a house a couple of blocks away, and neighbors quickly start noticing that a well-dressed man will go into this house. The fireplace will get lit, you know, sort of get some smoke coming out of the chimney. We'll sort of tie a little ribbon or a string or something around one of the open windows as an apparent signal, and then a hooded woman will quickly come in, enter, and, you know, we can only imagine what Teresa and Key are doing in there. Now, the shack is gone. Again, a little bit of then and now action. This is, again, 15th Street in Washington, just north of Lafayette Square. And this is what the block looked like a couple of years ago, you know, perpetually under construction. Who knows what's there now? But you get the idea. The historic building is not there today. Curiously enough, and I don't even know if they realize this, curiously enough, this is only a couple of blocks kind of this way from the current home of the American Battlefield Trust. So what does that say, huh? About Gary and the rest, all right. So things are going on. They're meeting in the Love Shack. Rumors are starting to percolate again. There's one evening, Sickles is away from home. He tells a couple of friends, hey, check in on Teresa when I'm gone. The friends come to the Sickles house kind of unannounced. Who is at the house? Philip Barton Key. Teresa and Key are there drinking champagne, eating salad. Big salad bowl with mixers, you know, a lot of innuendo going on here. They kind of barge in on Key and Teresa, you know, they kind of get all flustered, entertain the friends for a little while, the friends leave, and then the wife turns to the husband and says something like, oh, she is in so much trouble, you know, kind of thing. So again, it's very obvious, but finally on February 24th, 1859, this has been going on for, I don't know, a year and a half, February 24 of 1859, Sickles finally receives proof one night while opening his mail. He gets an anonymous letter in the evening mail. And it's so good, I am going to read a couple of highlights to you. Dear sir, deep regret and indispensable duty compels me to write to you, seeing that you are greatly imposed upon. There is a fellow, for I may say he is not a gentleman, by the names of Philip Barton Key, who rents a house for no other purpose than to meet your wife, Mrs. Sickles. He hangs a string out the window, she walks in, and sir, I do assure you that he has as much use of your wife as you have. With these few hints, I leave the rest to your imagination. Your friend, RPG. Thanks, I'm Frank. Now, we never really found out who RPG was. There's some theories on it. We never found out who it was. But now Sickles has got this proof, and somebody who saw Sickles the next day basically said he looked like a wild man, very distracted, crazy, insane, who might kill anybody that he were to meet and to encounter. But Sickles, with the help of some friends, does a little investigating, finds out over the next day or two, and pretty much confirms, yeah, that is Key and Teresa using this house a couple of blocks away on 15th Street. And so Saturday, February 26th, that's crazy. I don't want to get ahead on this one. February 26th, 1859. It's a Saturday night. It's a stormy night. The Sickles household staff can hear Dan and Teresa arguing. She goes up to her room at one point, and Sickles goes up after her, and after more continued arguing, Dan Sickles extracts a written confession from her. And again, for 1850s, this is pretty racy stuff. You know, you are all seasoned historians, you study history and that sort of thing. But you know, for a lot of people who wouldn't think, oh, things like this didn't happen in the old days. You know, great-great-great-grandma wouldn't have done stuff like this. Oh, yes, she did. It's all spelled out in the confession. Quote, there was a bed in the second story of the house. I did what is usual for a wicked woman to do. We had an improper interview. I undressed. Mr. Key undressed. Mr. Key has kissed me in our house, the Sickles house, a number of times, and here's the kicker for me. We have had connection in the Sickles house, in the parlor, on the sofa. All right, they're doing it on Sickles' couch, and then to add insult to injury, Mr. Key has even ridden in Mr. Sickles' carriage. I mean, come on, you're using your friend's wife, you're using the house, you gotta use his transportation too? Come on, this is awful. A true statement written by myself without any inducement held out by Mr. Sickles, etc., etc. So now we've got Teresa admitting to the whole sordid thing. It's Sunday, February 27th. The next day, the rain has broken. It's a beautiful spring day. Sickles knows. Teresa knows that Sickles knows. Key doesn't know that Sickles knows. So you can imagine a spring day like this. Key is probably feeling good, energetic. You know, he wants to come out for a little romance. And so Sickles notices the Key is now parading that morning through Lafayette Square with a signal. He is waving a white handkerchief. Now, can you see this in the back of the room? All right, it's a very, right, it's a good signal, right? We want Teresa to come out and play, we're waving our signal in Lafayette Square, and that's what Key is doing. So he's spotted going back and forth. Even Sickles' dog knows it. The dog runs out of the house and leaps into Key's lap at one point. And so Sickles looks out the window at one point and basically says, my God, that villain has passed my house. He's doing this. Everybody can see it. The whole town is going to know about it. I'm a ruined, I'm a humiliated man. Now, Sickles that day had been joined by a friend of his from New York, a guy by the name of Sam Butterworth. Not to be confused with Dan Butterfield. If I say Butterfield, it's a Freudian slip. We're talking about Sam Butterworth. But the guy from New York is there with Sickles, and Butterworth and Sickles can see Key out the window, and you know, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What's our plan? And this is where things get a little murky. So what they do, they say later, Sickles and Butterworth. Sickles and Butterworth say, this is the Sickles house, they say they decided to walk across the square to this clubhouse, which I mentioned briefly in an earlier slide, which was a boarding house for high-heeled men in the city, guys like Key, who when they were in town would sometimes rent out rooms. Sickles and Butterworth say they're going to walk across the square and basically interview Key's friends at the clubhouse. What do you know about this? You know, that sort of thing. That's what they say they're going to do. So they leave the house. Butterworth goes first, Sickles goes behind him, even though it's a warm spring day. Before they leave the house to talk to people, Sickles puts on a heavy overcoat and puts 3 guns in the pocket. All right, and they basically, by this time, Key has kind of moved over here to the southeast corner of the square. Butterworth is coming down Pennsylvania Avenue. Key sees Butterworth and says, something to the effect of, "Oh, good day, Butterworth." But Sickles, in a classic pre-Civil War flanking maneuver, is coming around the other end of the square, and when he sees Key, he basically shouts, "Key, you scoundrel, you have dishonored my house, and you must die." And with that, the fight is on. I know 2 active guys in the prime of their life, sort of thing. I'm thinking this would probably be a pretty good match. Sickles pulls out one of the guns, and he gets off a shot that somehow kind of grazes Key, really misses him. Key now jumps on Sickles, puts him in a bear hug. The gun drops to the ground. Sickles, though, breaks free from the bear hug, pulls out another gun, and as Key backs off, Key also reaches into his pocket. Does Key have a gun of his own? No, he has opera glasses. So he flings the opera glasses at Sickles. The opera glasses fall harmlessly to the ground. Key is now unarmed and defenseless. He starts shouting, "Look, this is a Sunday afternoon outside of the White House. The square is packed with people." Key starts shouting basically to the effect of "murder, murder," and things of that effect, and Sickles gets a shot off that basically strikes Key right in the groin. Now, I don't know if he aimed at the groin on purpose, if there was something symbolic intended there, or if it was just a lucky strike, but hits him in the groin. Key goes down, and now he's basically incapacitated. Sickles gets off another shot into Key's chest, and now chest cavity filled with blood. I'm not a doctor, but I think pretty deadly stuff. So Key is now struck in the chest. He's down by a tree. This is a contemporary image that was published of it. There's the opera glasses. Proof I didn't make that up. There's Key kind of down by the tree begging for his life. Sickles administering the fatal shot. And there's Butterworth just standing there watching the whole thing. Okay? So, that's one view of it. There was also a slightly different version. And again, you like this one better? Again, all the consistent sort of characters are all here. Butterworth just leaning against the fence, kind of watching the whole thing while Key meets his doom. So eventually Key is down. He's down for the count. Finally, people come in and intercede. Sickles is trying to get one more shot, a headshot, up to finish Key off, and the gun misfires. And at that point, they kind of step in, and everybody kind of breaks this up. Sickles seems to be shaken up a little bit, and is kind of just, did I kill him? Did I kill him? Kind of thing, kind of shaken up a little bit. They quickly kind of lead Congressman Sickles away from the scene of the crime. There's a story that among the witnesses was a young page working at the White House. The page bursts into Buchanan's office and says, "You're not going to believe what happened. Sickles just shot Key, right outside the door here." And the story goes, Buchanan says to the page, "Did you see it?" And the page says, "Yeah, I saw the whole thing." The story goes, Buchanan gives the page some money and says, "Get out of town until this blows over," kind of thing. So it kind of gives you an idea where some of this is going to go in terms of, using the influence. But we'll come back to more of that. So here's a modern view. As I said, kind of the southeast corner of Lafayette Square. That's what that corner looks like today. Again, how many people walk through that square to and from work or wherever, and no idea this great moment in our nation's history. Sad. Okay, so I told you before, he was staying in a clubhouse on the square. They carry him to the clubhouse, do whatever they're going to do for him. Again, another contemporary image. That's one of the things that's great about this. These were all contemporary images that were printed at the time, published at the time. And here's one of Key kind of breathing his last moments in this clubhouse, this boarding house. And what do we see here? Well, first of all, we see a crowd of onlookers kind of coming in and gawking at him. You know, we see kind of a quick inquest here. They can't revive Key. He really has no last words. And, you know, in a boarding house filled with rooms, they apparently can't find a bed or a sofa. They put him on the floor and a chair underneath his head to try to help him breathe. And that is where District Attorney Philip Barton Key, son of the storied Francis Scott Key, meets his end on the floor of this boarding house with a chair underneath his head while the gawkers are kind of looking at him. He's going to last for about 2 hours, but eventually Philip Barton Key will expire. Now this is an image of a house where he died, what I refer to again as the clubhouse, also called the John Rogers House after a prior owner. There is a noteworthy Civil War connection associated with this house. Anybody know what it is? In Lafayette Square? Noteworthy connection? I'll tell you. A couple of years later, 6 to be exact, it was the same house where on the night of the Lincoln assassination, Lewis Powell, or Lewis Payne if you prefer, almost killed William Seward. Exact same house. So a little bit of, again, Civil War related trivia, just to try to connect all the dots on that. And really a cursed house when you think about it. That building no longer stands in Lafayette Square today. It is on site today as a federal courthouse. So again, like most of these buildings, as I said at the outset, no longer with us. But now we transition over to the trial phase of the story. And, you know, for years I've done it, other Gettysburg guides have done it. We often refer to, in many ways, Dan Sickles, the O.J. Simpson of the American Civil War. Although in 2025, you meet more and more people who don't know the O.J. connection. And then you really got to sidebar, and it's just too messy. So I'm not going to be, but you get the idea. This was, for those of us who are old enough to remember, this is kind of the equivalent of the O.J. trial of the 19th century. Others called it the trial of the century, the Washington tragedy, things of that nature. And it got huge for what you could do at the time, media coverage. All over the country, a sitting congressman has shot a district attorney from a storied family right outside Buchanan's house. You know, it's got everything going for it. The New York Times, Harper's Weekly, Washington, Philadelphia, San Francisco, East Coast, West Coast, small towns like Gettysburg. Our newspapers in Gettysburg covered the case, covered the trial. There's one thing I want to point out here is I've got some examples of it up on screen here. Notice particularly this image. Calculated to elicit sympathy for the defendant, right? An aggrieved husband grieving what has been taken away from him. That would quickly become one of the themes of this. It was not that Congressman Sickles was a murderer. It was that Congressman Sickles' wife had fallen prey to this adulterer, and you know that we really needed to forgive him. And public opinion was very much right off the bat in Sickles' favor. It really was a case of, look, we've got to let the law do what it's going to do and get all the facts of the case out. But public opinion was very much in Sickles' favor from the outset. The other aspect of this, which was not really known at the time, Dan and Teresa started corresponding while he was incarcerated and during the trial. And so already you kind of have the makings of some forgiveness and some reconciliation going on there, but that was kind of kept from the public as well. So the Dream Team, again, kind of an O.J. connection. Sickles using his money, using his influence with the Buchanan administration, using his influence with Tammany Hall, New York, assembles the equivalent of a legal dream team. One of the enduring myths of the case that I often encounter is people usually are aware of, future Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's presence on the dream team. Stanton was an attorney from Ohio prior to the American Civil War. Stanton was on the defense team, but I often hear people saying Stanton was Sickles' only lawyer and that Stanton got Sickles off. And that's really not true. Stanton was very important to the defense, but the real lead attorney was a New Yorker by the name of James Brady. James Brady had served as New York Attorney General. He had turned down an offer to be United States Attorney General. He was supposed to be very proficient in matters of insanity and very good in front of a jury. He was something like 51 wins and 1 loss or something like that when he got his case before a jury. Again, maybe almost like a Shapiro-Johnny Cochran thing going here. But again, James Brady was really the guy in charge. John Graham, his brother Charles, would fight in the Army of the Potomac later, throw that in his Civil War connection. One of the attorneys on the case was also Thomas Marr, who would later go on to help form the Irish Brigade. Marr was really kind of a young attorney and didn't really have a whole lot going on with the defense. But again, just some Civil War connections. But it's really, again, Brady who is kind of leading the show here. Prosecution was basically led by one man, Robert Ould. Robert Ould had been Key's assistant district attorney and now has gotten battlefield promotion because his boss has been murdered. And now he's got to try the guy who killed his boss. Now, this is an image of Ould, and this is me standing by Ould's grave, which is in Richmond's Hollywood Cemetery. In the Civil War, the Richmond connection with Ould is that after this all blows over and during the American Civil War, Ould would later basically move with his family to Richmond, and from 62 to 65, Ould would be the Confederate agent of exchange for prisoners of war. So Ould would be a guy who would be connected in the Confederacy afterwards, and I think it leads to me some credence to this idea that pre-war Washington had a lot of Confederate sympathizers in the ranks. I mean, here's a very prominent one as an example. But again, that's all in the future, and for now, we're going to be trying the case. So the trial will occur in April of 1859. I kind of laugh when I think about it. The trial's going to last 20 days. Would the OJ trial go on for like a year or something? Again, just to kind of show you today how we've layered bureaucracy and process and procedure on top of everything. We can't do anything quickly anymore. But this, the trial of the century, they still concluded in about 20 days. Now, it did take 3 days and 160 prospects to find 12 impartial jurymen. Remember what I said before? Public opinion, very much in Sickles' favor. Courtroom is packed. You got newsmen from all over the country. Generally speaking, women were generally not permitted to attend. And when they asked Sickles, how do you plead? Not guilty. Even though he shot the guy in front of a dozen eyewitnesses, not guilty. So what's the defense strategy going to be? Well, first of all, we go with the prosecution because they lead off. So the prosecution leads off. They're going to call all the witnesses. Sickles was, quote unquote, a walking magazine who killed Key in front of multiple eyewitnesses. Probably thinking this is going to be an open and shut case. If we can't get a murder rap out of this, at least we're going to get manslaughter. I mean, too many witnesses. The guy's obviously dead. How can this get screwed up? Well, when the dream team opens the defense on day 6, they start pretty much by talking about the notion that Sickles, the husband, should have been protecting his property. Self-defense, protecting your property. These are themes that come into it right away. And they also bring in something called the unwritten law, which is the supposed right of the individual husband to avenge wrongs against your personal or family honor. So they're not only, they're appealing to the white male sort of, I hate to use the word aristocracy, but you know what I'm trying to say, the white male establishment, that's a better word, and kind of saying, look, if this was your wife, what would you do kind of thing. So the defense is appealing to that right away. They start throwing in the Bible. What happens to adulterers in the Bible? They're put to death. So we start throwing that in right away. No man could exist in society knowing that others were smirking at him because of this. You can't have that. And so this all kind of led to a situation where Dan's mind had been quote-unquote affected, there was not sufficient time for his passions to cool. And that's really where we're going to go with the defense. Now, how many attorneys do we have in the audience? We're probably a couple, I would think. Okay, a couple. I'm not an attorney. I'm a Gettysburg historian. I'm just playing an attorney tonight, kind of thing. The trial of the case, the defense, has really been ultimately remembered as the first successful temporary insanity defense ever put before an American jury. That's how it's remembered. I've, over the years, looked in law journals and things of that nature, and it really does seem to be the case. That's a little bit of a myth. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but that's how it's been remembered, as the first temporary insanity case. Even though, again, nobody's using the term temporary insanity. They're talking more about, did you, at the time you committed the act, know from right or wrong? And that's kind of how this sort of defense develops. Now, one of the things that came in was the judge agreed that Teresa's adultery, because it was a fact of the case, could be admitted. And I've heard from many times doing this over the years, I'll often, particularly from women in the audience, will say, well, that's not fair. Sickles had affairs. How come she couldn't have affairs? His affairs were not considered legal facts of the case. Her affair led directly to the motive, and that was why that was admissible. And so what happens, once the adultery was a fact of the case, the defense then produced 43 witnesses who had knowledge of the affair and got on the stand and testified about it, sometimes in graphic detail. And it is said that Sickles himself broke down 3 times listening to this testimony of his wife and his friend, having this affair. There's one great quote where one of the newspapers says, quote, Sickles' vision was quenched in scalding tears, his limbs paralyzed, his forehead throbbing as though it had been bludgeoned by some ruffian, and his whole frame was convulsed. And at times they actually had to stop the testimony, to make sure that he was okay. Spectators were so moved they started crying and that sort of thing. And again, it was a tactic by the Dream Team really to help demolish Teresa and demolish Key, and really make the victim, Key, the guilty party here. So meanwhile, Teresa, there it goes again, Teresa did not testify. This is a contemporary image of her being quietly sent to New York, away from the action, get her out of town, and pretty much Teresa's days as the wife of a high-flying congressman were pretty much over forever. Now, contemporary image, especially maybe those of you in front who can see this a little better, I love this image for a reason. What is everybody in the image doing? Not crying, good guess. They're basically avoiding looking at her. The Scarlet Woman kind of thing, don't look at her sort of thing. And that was a real thing. There was an account from a chaplain who later served in the Excelsior Brigade, who one time got in a carriage with her and said, it was all I could do to avoid looking at her sort of thing. And here's an image of that. They're avoiding her, looking at her or meeting her gaze as she is quietly led away. Okay, so like I said, this runs on for about 20 days. Stanton does lead the closing arguments for the defense, and again, he references Teresa as the wretched mother, the ruined wife, who is not yet plunged into the horrible filth of prostitution to which she was rapidly descending because of this affair. The theory of our case was Key's immoral power over her, enormous, monstrous, altogether unparalleled in American history, dragging her day by day through the streets in order that he might gratify his lust. The husband beholds them in the very act of trying to withdraw her from the house, meets him in the act, slays him, and we say that slaying stands on the firmest principles of self-defense. Goes back to what I said before, self-defense, not so much temporary insanity being the key to the case. Stanton's closing arguments drew applause from the audience in the courtroom. And the prosecutor, who at this point, after 20 days of this, must have had a sense that he was hopeless hopelessly outnumbered, still said, look, if they were caught in the act, it's manslaughter, but if this man was killed because of revenge, then it's murder. So Old is still doing the best he can to try to get a murder rap out of this. But I would think kind of like Marcia Clark and Chris Darden, they kind of realize this is just starting to slip away from him. And so we get to jury deliberation. Now the judge, when we get to jury deliberation, does say that you should consider what the state of Mr. Sickles' mind was at that time, and if the jury has any doubt as to the question of sanity at the time, then Mr. Sickles should be acquitted. So we do introduce the idea of sanity, insanity into the jury deliberation. And again, that's one of the things the jury has to deliberate. They're going to depart in the afternoon of April 26th. They will be gone for a grand total of 70 minutes. So kind of like the OJ trial, they come back shockingly fast. They're only gone for 70 minutes. They come back, and you probably guessed by now, the verdict is not guilty. And there's pandemonium in the courtroom. Order in the court. You see in movies, kind of thing. Edwin Stanton breaks out into dancing a jig in the middle of the courtroom. Prisoners to be released immediately. One of Sickles' friend's wives slaps him on the back and says, now we got you off this time, Dan. Be a good boy. Don't get into trouble again. And so the newspapers are commenting on this. As Sickles is pulled out of the courtroom, people are so hysterical, they're tearing his clothes off, his souvenirs, and things of that nature. The police got to try to get him out of there. Leave 3 cheers and all of that 19th century stuff. But the newspapers comment on it, and as the New York Times said, the man who violates the honor, desolates the home of his neighbor, does so at the peril of his life, and if he falls by the husband's hand, he deserves his doom. So what did I say at the beginning? Public opinion in Sickles' favor as the aggrieved husband, 20 days of trial, 70 minutes of jury deliberation did not change public opinion in any way, shape, or form, and that was how the New York Times reported it. Now for my one attorney in the audience, many, many years ago as I was kind of getting into this case, I did have a friend who's an attorney who said to me one time, which I think is probably right, that it's also a classic example of jury nullification, where basically the jury may know that something was manslaughter or murder, but they go ahead and kind of more or less rule with their hearts than their head, sort of thing. One juror told James Brady that the citizens of Washington are not going to be left behind any other parts of this country in devotion to the family altar, sort of thing. Again, jury nullification, as they call it. So by the summer of 1859, you might have thought everyone going to kind of go their separate ways here. Sickles was released. Unlike OJ, Sickles didn't really have to promise to go find the real killer, sort of thing. But you might have thought he was going to be released, presumably resume his career. Public opinion was on his side. Well, I touched on this earlier during the trial, but by the summer of '59, the newspapers are now reporting on an interesting phenomenon. Dan and Teresa have reconciled. And we started with the New York Herald in July. Both were living near each other in New York. Quote, both parties have agreed to reconciliation, and it is said that their love is greater than ever. And it's at this point that public opinion and all of Sickles' friends now start to turn against him. Because now really the idea is, look, wait a minute. We went to all this trouble, all this time, all this money to get you off. And if you were just going to reconcile with her and forgive her anyways, maybe you could have been a little more forgiving of Key and we could have just saved the whole thing. And this is really now how the public starts to look at it. Why, the Philadelphia Press says if Teresa can be forgiven, why couldn't Key? The New York Herald calls the Sickles' representation of a bad state of society, where political success and power are to be had at any sacrifice of honor and morality. Okay? 2025, we're giving this talk. 1859. Couldn't that last statement apply in 2025 to any celebrity political scandal, many that we can think of, as it did in 1859? Political success and power are to be had at any sacrifice of honor and morality. It really kind of makes this a timeless story. Just one that in this case involves a future Civil War general. So now you might wonder why Sickles took her back. Sickles did what New York politicians and attorneys and Dan Sickles of the day would do, basically resorted to the newspapers in mounting a defense. And what Sickles published in one of the newspapers that basically, look, my sense of duty extended to an erring and repentant wife, the misery and perils, I've saved her from the misery and perils from which I've rescued the mother of my child. So he tries to appeal to, look, the mother of my child, I didn't want her living on the streets like a common prostitute. I brought the wife and child back into my house, but it really wasn't enough. It really wasn't enough to turn public attention, and such that, Sickles now quietly ended out this congressional term, which had started with so much promise. Mary Chestnut has this famous quote where one day she's visiting Congress and she sees a well-dressed man kind of sitting off to the side by himself, and she says to one of her friends, "Who is that?" And the friend says, "Oh, that's Dan Sickles." Unsavory subject, let's just kind of leave him alone kind of thing. And Mary Chestnut writes that Sickles was left to himself as if he had smallpox, sort of thing. But such a change, by the spring of 1861, from what had started so well only a few years before. Now, Teresa, just as a footnote here, Teresa will die in 1867 at the age of 31 from what was probably tuberculosis. They stayed married through the rest of her days, but never really publicly reconciled. As we get into the Civil War and through the Civil War, she never really gains that status that would befit the wife of, what would become a major general in Sickles' case. And so there is a connection to the Civil War. A couple connections we've done tonight. But the through line here to the Civil War is that when the Civil War starts in the spring of '61, former Congressman Sickles is now out of office. He is practicing law as a private citizen in New York, but outraged, what he felt was the secession of the Southern members of his Democrat Party. At the beginning of the Civil War, Sickles raised troops in New York, and to make a long story short, former Congressman Dan Sickles, with the help of the new President Abraham Lincoln, will eventually become Brigadier General and Major General Dan Sickles. And as we said at the outset, for me it's Gettysburg, but you guys have Fredericksburg, and again, a huge, huge part of the battle of Chancellorsville as well, and that's sort of the connection there. So Congressman Sickles becomes General Sickles. And with that, to this day, the senseless murder of Philip Barton Key remains unsolved. Okay, somebody at this point, I've had people literally jump up and say, Jim, this case is not unsolved. Okay, it's just a joke. We all know who did it. Nobody was ever prosecuted for it. How about that? But I do have a Crime Stoppers hotline, one Dan Sickles. If you want to call and give me any tips, we will try and find the guy and put him away for the murder of Philip Barton Key. And so with that, that's the end of the story tonight. As I said, many Civil War connections, leading a controversial congressman into a very controversial Union general. And, Civil War or not, it really is a timeless story about political corruption, influence, adultery, intrigue, all of that stuff. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for listening tonight. And I don't know if we have time for one or two questions. Okay, and with that, thank you guys.